Idaho College and this evening's broadcast of the North Idaho College Public Forum, a student production. Your moderator is North Idaho College political scientist Tony Stewart.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. On behalf of our panel, I have the very special privilege of welcoming you to the 174th Forum. I also have the honor to welcome to our program two guests that are very involved in environmental issues and energy questions. To my far left is Doug Scott, who has been on campus today in relation to an energy workshop. Mr. Scott is the Northwest representative of the Sierra Club and is located in Seattle, Washington. Doug, it's a pleasure having you with us.
Thank you.
Also to my immediate left is a member of the state legislature from Montana. She serves in the State House of Representatives, Representative Dorothy Bradley from Bozeman, Montana. Dorothy is chairman of the Natural Resources Committee, and she's also a member of the Business and Industry Committee. Representative Bradley, it's a pleasure having you with us.
Thank you.
Also, our panel members this evening, to my far right is Dr. Ken Wright, who is chairman of the Division of Physical Sciences at North Idaho College, teaching in the field of chemistry, holding a PhD from the University of Idaho in chemistry. Dr. Wright, it's a pleasure having you back.
Thanks, Tony.
And to my immediate right is also another regular panel member, Mary Lou Reed, who lives in Coeur d'Alene and is very active in political affairs and environmental issues. As to educational background, she's a graduate of Mills College and has done graduate work in theology and religion at Columbia University. Mary Lou, welcome back.
Thanks, Tony.
We'll proceed to questions at once, and the first question this evening from Dr. Wright.
Dorothy Bradley, I understand that you're involved primarily with energy rate considerations in the state of Montana. This is one of your areas of interest. I'd like to ask you what's wrong with, in your opinion, with the way we've been pricing energy, the rate structures that we've got now?
Two things in particular I think are wrong that could be quite easily improved. In way of background, Montana has three different classifications for energy. That is the residential, the commercial, and the industrial classifications. The average price that the residential classification pays is the highest, and the industrial price is much, much lower. For example, the average residential rate is about 2.5 cents a kilowatt hour, and the industrial rate is much lower, in fact, a little less than 1 cent a kilowatt hour. And the pattern that this has led to in Montana, in one particular distribution system that I've studied, is that about half of the energy consumption is attributable to industry, but industry only pays a little over the fourth of the total revenue. And it's my feeling that there is increasing evidence that points to the fact that high residential rates are in fact subsidizing too cheap industrial rates, and I think that's one area where we need further study and possible changes. My specific work in the past summer has been with regard to the residential classification only. Within this classification we have what's called a declining block rate structure. And what this is, it's a declining block rate system so that the more energy you use, the lower rates you pay, which among other things is a built-in incentive to consume more energy instead of rewarding those who are conserving. It also happens to be very inequitable in that it places most of the burden on the low consumers, which in most cases are also low income. And so for that reason, I've been working on another proposal which would change around that declining block rate structure and offer the cheapest rates for the lowest consumers.
With regard to the industrial rate, I think maybe economists might argue that this is necessary for a healthy economy. And we certainly have had this kind of thing in the past. Do you agree with this contention?
I would like to see energy pay their own way. Now, maybe they are, and I'm not sure about this yet, but I don't think it's quite right to have the residential users subsidize the industries. What I think would be a more proper economic system is to have the industries pay for the true cost of the energy that they're consuming, then pass that cost on with their product ultimately to the consumers, but at least through the market for that particular product. thereby that product will reflect the true cost of energy. And I think that's a fairer way to go than to have the residential users subsidize that product by paying rates that are too high.
Mary Lou Reed.
Well, Dorothy, I think that your Montana power is actually about twice as expensive as maybe the Washington and the Oregon power. I'm not really sure about Idaho. So I think maybe I want to direct a question to Doug Scott that has to do with the aluminum companies. I'm not sure if he knows what their prices are that they are paying, but I think they're paying perhaps half what an aluminum company would be paying in Montana. And my question for Doug is, what do you think we should do about energy-intensive industries such as the aluminum companies? Do you feel that they have some waste in that they're wasting electricity and that they should be paying more?
Well, I think we have to start from essentially the historical position, which is that in the Northwest we have subsidized the light metals industry. Located all along the Columbia River, there are now 14 aluminum and magnesium reduction plants which consume an enormous portion of the electrical energy load in the Northwest, and which do so at very heavily subsidized rates. They import their bauxite from halfway around the world to take advantage of the Northwest's historically cheap energy. What we now know is that energy in the future in the Northwest is not going to be cheap. If its true cost is known, the true cost of energy in the Northwest is going to rise very quickly, particularly as we start building more expensive kinds of thermal plants on top of what has been cheap hydropower. And the question now then is, do we continue the pattern of subsidization by cheap rates of the aluminum and light metals industry, or do we begin to shift their share of the burden to them, and leaving to them the question of whether they want to stay in the Northwest? And I would presume that with their capital investment they would stay for at least a period of time. We must remember that the light metals industry is energy intensive, but it isn't job intensive. And there's a great tendency today to debate these things in terms of jobs. Well, yes, maybe we ought to charge the aluminum companies for the full cost of the power that they use, but if we do, they're going to leave this region and we'll have a terrible economic impact. Well, there's always economic impact when you readjust society to fit the conditions that have come to bear. We could still be using sailing ships as our means of international trade if we were locked into preserving the jobs of sailors who climbed in the rigging. But changes must come, and changes ought to be planned for as best they can. We think the market mechanism ought to be allowed to operate, charging the true cost of energy use to the user. And in the case of the aluminum industry, I think they're going to have to face the fact that the era of cheap energy is over for them just as much as it is for the rest of us in the Northwest.
Well, we hear this figure of between 30 and 40% in industry that could be cut back of energy use and that would not harm our economy. Do you feel that this is true in the aluminum industry, or is this an unfair question?
Well, I'm not sure that I can, having not toured the aluminum plants and so forth, I'm not sure that I could say with assurance. Clearly, the basic processes of light metals reduction that are involved in the aluminum industry and the magnesium reduction industry in the Northwest are very energy intensive. And I'm sure there's fat in that system. There's fat in just about everything. And I'm sure they can turn the lights down in the factory and use their energy more efficiently, perhaps readjust the times of day that they're operating to balance out their demand. In the final analysis, once you've got the fat out of the system, you still have to look at how much energy they're using. We can knock out if it's 30% or 40% of the waste of energy that may be there in any industry, but still we're going to have to face the hard fact that the energy they still need to continue operation is going to have to come from somewhere and at some price. Now, the first thing to do, it seems to me, is to make it clear to those who might want to build a new aluminum plant or magnesium plant in the Northwest that the era of cheap energy is in fact over, and not continue to entice this kind of very heavily energy-intensive industry into the Northwest under the guise of cheap power. And we've been working to discourage a couple of the Johnny-come-latelys who wanted to expand their plants or build new plants in the Northwest. And I think we've seen the end of the expansion of the aluminum industry here, although there are a couple of plants currently in contention and controversy over in the state of Washington.
I have a question that I would like to direct to both of you, or either one that chooses to answer it, and it's relating to what Mrs. Reed has just been asking. And that is, there seems to be a debate going on in this country about how to distribute among our citizenry those resources that are still available, and especially in the area of energy. And the debate takes the two forms that you're so familiar with, one being that we should have higher prices, as we've been talking about here this evening, and therefore pass it on to the consumer, and therefore through higher prices maybe they would consume less. I'm thinking of petroleum products in particular, is one school of thought. Another school of thought is that we maybe should set some kind of quotas based upon the fact that if you do it through prices, you may hurt the lower income people in particular. What is your position on this debate that's taking place? We'll start with you, Representative Bradley.
Let me refer back to my lifeline concept. And the idea embodied in that is that you do increase the electricity rates at the higher ends of consumption, but on the lower ends, in the area that might be called basic necessities, you have the lowest price, and hopefully something that's very reasonable and within reach of the low-income people. Now, it's my feeling, just in the residential classification, our lifestyle at this point is dependent on a certain amount of electricity. We simply have to have it for necessities such as refrigeration, cooking, and lighting, and so forth. At those very low levels, it's very difficult for people to make sacrifices and to conserve energy. And I don't think that they should be penalized by higher and higher rates at that low consumption level. But in fact, they have been, and they are, and that's where the increasing rates are being wrested. That's where the heaviest burden is. So it's my feeling that those low consumption groups should not be penalized. But if you increase the rates at the higher consumption levels, it's at that end that people can, in fact, find alternative kinds of energy. They can usually cut back on certain numbers of appliances. They can install new heating devices in their home and become less reliant on natural gas or electricity. And it's at the higher end where the elasticity lies and where people will really respond to increased prices. So that's where we should try to get the response, and that's where we should try to wrest the conservation. That's just with regard to the residential classification.
Now, in some other areas, it's a little more difficult to determine what is essential and what's not. I'm thinking in particular in consumption of gasoline, for example, and what a family may need, or if a gentleman's occupation depends upon travel and another individual's does not. How are we going to take this policy that you're advocating and apply it more across the board in other areas?
Well, this probably is not a very popular stand, but I think if we don't change our transportation policies very rapidly, that some kind of a rationing system is the only fair way to go, because by a rationing system you do hold the prices down to a certain extent, so you don't penalize low-income people and you don't ration according to ability to pay, which I think is quite unfair. But I think it's also important when we do have to make some sacrifices that everyone make equal sacrifices and they not simply be made by those who can't afford the fuel.
Okay, Mr. Scott.
Well, I'm just nodding my head in complete agreement with that. It's not a debate between two systems, one of which is a quota, and one of which is something else. They're both quotas. It's a question of how much of that quota any one person gets. And by the ability to pay mechanism, you simply say, if you're rich and have lots of money, whether you deserve it by any particular standard or not, relative to some guy who has to get to his job and doesn't have a lot of money to pay for gasoline, you've really said we have a quota that favors the guy with a lot of money. And there's just no social equity in that. Now, in the long run, and maybe not the very long run, we're going to need to get to much more rational transportation systems, as Dorothy says, that take the fat out of the system all the way around, and that get us back within a kind of a sane lifestyle that we can afford in our energy budget. In the meanwhile, I think I just agree, and it may not be a popular stand, that we're going to have to go with gasoline, and probably with fuel oil, to some kind of quota mechanism that more equitably distributes the limited resources that are available. Now, you can broaden this out and get beyond energy we're going to run up against the limits in a lot of resources, materials, wood, a lot of the kinds of things that our affluent, reckless, extravagant society has taken for granted. And as we run up against material shortages in the limits of a finite planet, we're going to have to find ways to make judgments between end uses of those materials which are more essential and which are less essential. Now, no one argued during the short water year here a couple of years ago in the Northwest that if it came down to it, we ought to turn down outdoor advertising, as Governor McCall did in the state of Oregon, as opposed to turning off respirators in hospitals. That's a rather clear distinction in the relative social importance of the end use of energy. We're going to face similar questions, and we're going to have to find mechanisms. Electric energy, because of the way that it's been priced in the past and the way it's billed, offers an easier opportunity to get started on a price mechanism just by readjusting the rate structures. And we're going to have to find mechanisms to do that in gasoline, in the end use of many kinds of products that are, in fact, going to be limited.
Thank you.
Dr. Wright. Mr. Scott has just made allusion to limits, finite limits on this planet, and one of the means that's been suggested for extending these limits has been nuclear energy. I'd like to get Mr. Scott's reaction to what's wrong, if anything, in your opinion, with using nuclear energy to supply our energy needs in the future. The government has made some noises about making a rather large commitment toward doing this kind of thing. What do you feel about this kind of a decision on the part of the government?
Well, my own reaction to the question of proliferation of nuclear power plants is an ethical and moral one. I do not believe that we have anything like a right of visiting the risks that are involved in extensive deployment of nuclear technology on future generations. The price in terms of the risks that will have to be borne for thousands and thousands and thousands of years from the highly dangerous byproducts and waste products of the nuclear energy cycle are, to my mind, simply unconscionable. I don't think we have that right to meet our short-term, luxurious, extravagant uses of energy. Now, we would be in a much better position, morally, in my view, to make a decision for people who aren't even here yet, for unborn generations, that they'll have to live with that risk if we'd cut all the fat out of our system and if we were talking about really essential uses of electricity. But so long as there's a single piece of neon still lit, I don't see that we have the right to say that there is some social necessity that so drives us to this very dangerous, very ill-prepared technology that we ought to put it online. I just don't see how we can do that. Now, quite apart from that, which is a long-term ethical question of where do our rights end and where do the rights of future generations begin? And not just generations of people, but we share this planet with some other beings that prefer to live and breathe. There are immediate short-term questions of the safety of the reactor technology that exists in fission today. Facetiously, but not very, I could call your attention to a recent incident in the South with the power plant that came very close to an extremely serious reactor accident. The industry in the nuclear field prefers to call them incidents, but this was the Browns Ferry plant in Georgia, where a workman installing insulation around the reactor core was testing for air leaks and drafts, and he was pushing this plastic insulation into little holes where there were drafts, and the way he tested was the way you'd test for a draft. He lit a candle and held it up, and surprise, surprise, the insulation caught fire. It took him 8 hours to get the fire out, and in that time, the reactor came very close to a serious nuclear accident. And it's just chilling to think that a workman with a candle, after all the assurances we've had from the advocates of nuclear power about how safe it is, that a workman with a candle could bring us that close to the kind of serious accident that was involved there. And then you get into a third issue involving nuclear power, which is almost unanswerable, it seems to me, and that is the very serious question, as you proliferate nuclear technology, particularly to other countries, of terrorism and the sabotage of such plants, or the acquisition by irresponsible parties of the weapons-grade plutonium that's a byproduct of the fission cycle. And it seems to me that until those safety questions are answered and until the whole question of the security of the fuels is answered, that we just have no business putting our eggs all in the nuclear basket. And yes, we're going to beat the swords into plowshares, but let's not do it until we've got answers to questions that, where I said I don't see that there are any answers to them at all. I just think it's a grave error on the part of society to tolerate the expansion into the nuclear field, certainly on the scale that's being discussed by the administration currently, when this kind of enormous implication still can't be answered. And as someone pointed out at the forum in Coeur d'Alene today on nuclear energy, if nuclear energy were so safe, why won't any insurance company insure it? Why do we have to have a federal law that limits the liability for the disastrous effects of a nuclear accident? If it's so safe, why can't we just leave it to the free enterprise insurance system to insure it? And if you can't get insurance on the open market, then apparently you ought not to build it because it apparently is too risky.
Mary Lou Reed.
Dorothy, Montana has some special problems caused because you're also rich in coal, and I think we'd like to find out, well, for one thing, were you involved in helping to create the legislation to cover the Strip Mining Reclamation Act? And would you explain this to our viewers? What is involved in that kind of legislation? Is it working, and what are some of the other problems that you have caused by strip mining?
We had a very strong Strip Mine Reclamation Act passed several years ago. It's supposed to be one of the best in the country. To a certain extent, I think it's working fairly well. My Committee on Natural Resources held an oversight hearing at the end of our past legislative session to examine the provisions in the law and see if we thought there were any areas that needed strengthening. We examined the administration of the Act to see how well that end was doing. And then finally, we did a little examination of just the question of reclamation itself. And I frankly think that we saw some problems in all three areas. Some of us feel that we could strengthen the Act, especially in the area of giving more protection to the alluvial valley floors, the areas that are particularly important in Montana for agricultural production. There was a proposed bill in the past session that would have given this added protection, probably would have only affected about 5% of the strippable area. And unfortunately, we were not able to pass that. I think it's important, though, not to become lax after the passage of a bill, because I think there are always areas where it can be strengthened. I think we have a very good administering agency, but I think we probably are a little short of personnel. For example, we don't have, in my opinion, enough people to inspect all the strip mines as much as they should be inspected. And I don't really feel that we have enough personnel to double-check all the information that is submitted by a coal company which is applying for a strip mining permit. So again, in the administrative angle, I think there are some improvements that could be made there. And if you're ever weak in administering an act, then even if you have the strongest act in the world, it's not going to do that much good. Finally, about the question of reclamation itself, I think there's some truly monumental efforts being made to reclaim the semi-arid northern plains. But I think it can fairly be said that at this time we're on a trial and error experiment. We don't really know yet if that area with very scant rainfall and a very thin layer of topsoil can be fully reclaimed to a point of self-sustaining capacity.
So you are questioning the premise that reclamation is even possible in that kind of an area?
I'm very worried about that, and we will only know over a longer period of time when we've had some drought cycles, and we can see that could it truly be reclaimed, but that's going to take a number of years.
What are we really talking about when we're talking about reclamation in some of the less arid areas? Are you talking a period of say 20 years that it will take for the land to return to its previous appearance, its previous ability to raise crops or to raise cattle? What are the aims?
In other areas?
Yes, outside of the really arid ones. When you're talking about areas that you think really will be strip mined, and you hope that the reclamation will be done in a proper way. When you're asking for a proper kind of reclamation, what are you hoping for? How long is it going to take?
Well, according to some of the predictions, that in eastern Montana, it may take literally thousands of years for the soil structure to again work back into a state where it will produce grass that animals can graze on without artificial fertilization and artificial watering. As far as comparing it to other strip-mined lands, I'm not very familiar with some of these other areas, but it could probably be said that they have had reclamation success. But there are many feet of topsoil in these other areas, and there's many, many inches of rainfall every year. And that really cannot be compared to eastern Montana, where there's a few inches of topsoil in most cases and about 14 and sometimes less inches of rainfall.
I guess what I'm getting at is that they're trying to take ideas from another place and impose them upon Montana, and Montana has its special problems which may really defy reclamation. Is that right?
That's right.
Thank you.
My question I wish to direct to Mr. Scott. It seems to me, as we've been for almost 30 minutes pursuing this whole question of what's happening in the field of energy and also the land and what's happening to it, it all comes down to one thing, and that's people and the population of our country and the world. And from all statistics that I have seen, I realize that the population is mushrooming at a tremendous rate, and that within approximately 30 years our population will double in the world, and if that continues, then it's going to double again. And all those people have to have food, and they all use resources, and they all use land. Aren't we talking about a population explosion problem? And if so, what are we going to do about it? Or is it going to be fatal, or is this too pessimistic a view?
Well, I can only express the hope that that's too pessimistic a view. It is certainly the root problem. It is certainly the most fundamental issue that we must deal with, because there is no solution, regardless of whatever technology we apply in the United States to meet what we consider to be our problems, that we're going to ever be able to resolve our problems apart from the planet that we're a part of. And if that planet is to persist with an expanding population, the only answer is that as more people go around, the limited resources, the limited economy on which those people can depend, the limited energy budgets that the planet can tolerate. There are planetary limits on how much burning we can do, how much carbon dioxide we can put into the atmosphere and so forth. We're just going to run up against a truly fatal phenomenon. Now, the world population problem is so enormous that it is almost mind-boggling. And I think the only answer is to deal with it with a level of seriousness and concern that it merits, which is just absolutely fundamental. We don't hear about it. We don't hear about it from our national leaders. We don't have, we aren't really dealing with it as though it posed the kind of fundamental problem that it does. True, progress has been made. It has become a matter of public concern in this country and around the world. The United Nations, through the population programs that it carries on, is doing its best in education and so forth. But to what degree are we really giving that fundamental problem the level of attention and energy and resources to really deal with it? You put your finger on what is absolutely the limiting factor. We're not spinning our wheels if we don't solve the population problem. We're going quietly back down the hill towards just catastrophe.
Mr. Scott, at these world conferences on population, the third world in particular points out to the United States that you're 6% of the world's population, yet you consume approximately 1/3 of its products. And why don't we talk about that? This is their position. Whereas we say, well, why don't we talk about your population growth at such a rate? And so it's become a very great political problem. How do you perceive that there should be, or should there be, any changes in international politics in relation to this question, or the policy of this country or any other country? How are we going to bridge this gap, is what I'm saying, between some very divergent viewpoints in international politics?
Well, I can only state a personal opinion on that point, and that is, I think that the people of the third world are absolutely correct. I don't think that they're 75% correct and we're 25% correct. We are using their resources. We are using the lion's share of the energy resources and the material resources of the planet at this point in time to maintain a level of affluence and indulgence of our every wish that the rest of the world can have no hope of obtaining. And it just simply isn't fair. And so to protest that, well, you get your own house in order before we're going to do anything about the fact that we're ripping off a greatly disproportionate share of the world's resources just seems to me to be out of the question. I don't see how you can make that argument with a straight face. Now, I think we have to bend over backwards to show good faith to the third world in trying to suggest to them that there are things that they need to do about their problems to demonstrate that we aren't simply trying to be Fortress America or Fortress the Western world to hold on to our level of disproportionate consumption and material affluence.
But even if we do that, isn't there a problem in cultural characteristics too, that some of them are religious in nature, and for other reasons that in some parts of the world that they have a tremendous belief in not attempting to have any birth control processes?
There certainly is, and I think that as with the same problem in our own society, that we're going to have to encourage rapid deployment of education, of the leadership of the world, of the leadership of those cultural forces, to bring home the very clear and obvious fact that the planet cannot go on with the kind of doubling of the population in shorter and shorter time periods that you express. It just, at last we learned that in fact we live on a finite planet. And if you and I appreciate that, then it's our turn to get that message across to people who are going to have to modify their way of life and their behavior and some of their beliefs, perhaps, ultimately. But they'll have to do it as their own choice. We aren't going to enforce, I don't think, that kind of behavior.
Thank you. Dr. Wright.
Tony's brought up the specter of the doomsday prophecies here, and I want to pursue that area a little bit more. Recently, in a speech in Seattle and in Portland, Mr. Donald Hodel, the Chief Administrator of the Bonneville Power Administration, has talked about the prophets of shortage, which he has termed environmentalists. And certainly Mr. Scott, as a representative of the Sierra Club, you would have to classify in everybody's mind as an environmentalist. I'd like to ask you for your reaction to that sort of an allegation.
Well, I have followed the course of Mr. Hodel's speech-making over the past several months with some considerable interest. I even went to the trouble to acquire copies of all the speeches that he's given over the last 6 months and read them the other day. And I must say that I can only regret the level and tone of the debate that Mr. Hodel has said he wished to foment in those speeches. I don't know whether his purpose is to try to provide a scapegoat for the fact that our society in the Northwest, as in the rest of the world, is going to have to face some new choices in energy matters. But that appeared to me to be a large part of his motive. He went on at some considerable length about the troublesome profits of shortage, the anti-achievers and anti-producers, by whom he meant environmentalists, who were holding up the development of needed energy resources for the Northwest and who were bringing all sorts of delays in the construction of power plants and one thing and another. And while for a moment I was tempted to take some satisfaction in his suggestion that we were having great impact on decisions being made in the Northwest, when I got to looking at the record, I couldn't find what he was talking about. He went on at some length, for example, about how environmentalists could bring any project to a halt with a $12 lawsuit. And one of our attorneys called him up and reported to him, Mr. Hodel is an attorney, but he hasn't practiced law apparently for some time, that the filing fees are now $15 in the federal courts, so that it is a little more expensive. Furthermore, the lawsuits that we have brought against some of the things that the Bonneville Power Administration is doing that we don't particularly care about have not as yet been successful. Whereas the suits that Mr. Hodel has been losing lately, the most recent one was brought by a Chamber of Commerce over in the Oregon coast, which disagreed with the decision that he made and was successful in the federal courts. So in that instance, the successful party in that lawsuit may have been a prophet of shortage. I wouldn't know. I doubt it. But it wasn't an environmentalist. It was a Chamber of Commerce. And I think what Mr. Hodel, he's feeling many pressures these days. The era of the free lunch in the Northwest electric energy picture is over. Many forces are bearing down on BPA to open up its decision-making processes for public participation. It's been a closed shop heretofore. And I think perhaps this multifaceted pressure just has kind of gotten to Mr. Hodel, and he's wanted to lash out at someone. I can only regret that the rhetoric that he engaged in was reminiscent of the kind of thing that Senator McCarthy made famous a few decades ago. And I would hope, as I've told Mr. Hodel subsequently in meetings with him, that he would try to engage with us in a more interesting and perhaps useful dialogue on the facts and the issues, and not name-calling, because I don't mind being called a prophet of shortage or an anti-achiever. I developed a thick skin a long time ago. But I don't think calling environmentalists who represent a large segment of society in the Northwest those kind of names contributes to getting good decisions made for the future of the Northwest.
Mary Lou Reed.
Well, environmentalists recently have been calling upon everyone to return to the land ethic of the Native American. And I don't know who this question is for, whether it's for Dorothy, who lives in Montana, where there are lots of Native Americans, or whether Doug has some success stories too. But I think frequently we feel that the Indians had the best ideas, but perhaps they are not currently quite involved with the land ethic now. Do you find that you have conflicts with your environmental groups and the Native Americans, or in Montana, are they working hand in hand? How about you and the Sierra Club, Doug?
Well, my personal experience is limited in this regard. The issues in the Northwest that involve Native Americans are only beginning really to come to the fore in a major way. And of course, the whole coal question on the Northern Cheyenne Reservation and other Indian lands in Wyoming and Montana is a prime example. We have similar resource issues that involve Native American interests coming to the fore in fishery rights and in many other areas. I think they're going to be involved. In general, I can only therefore express the hope that it's possible for people who presumably share a similar interest in the well-being of the land and a recognition that from the land comes everything else. Environmentalists and Native Americans can find the maximum of common interests to pursue. And I think there is a maximum of common interests, and I do know in one specific instance of a good degree of that kind of cooperation, and that is that the Nez Perce tribe of Indians are foursquare with the environmentalists and a vast majority of the public in this region in absolute opposition to the further damming of the Middle Snake River in Hell's Canyon, which is, after all, a part of their ancestral homeland.
So that's an instance where there is an agreement.
Yes.
How about in Montana?
I was just going to add one thing. Well, first of all, I think it's very important that all of us learn to share the Indians' belief of respect for the land, the whole land community on which we depend. I think two of the Indian tribes in Montana are literally struggling for survival, and because they're a small group with limited numbers based on a small plot of land, an Indian reservation, they're being forced to come and make certain decisions before the rest of us have really had to do that. And I would just say, I think those two tribes are literally struggling for survival. They're trying to grapple with such questions as how they're going to survive in the face of possibly being outnumbered on their own reservations, as we have more and more energy development, which brings in a great population which would simply outnumber the Indians themselves. And it's going to be very interesting to see how they resolve their problem, because they're being forced to make choices before the rest of us are.
Do you feel it's a very hopeful outlook at this point?
No, I don't. I think it's a very dismal outlook.
Representative Stadler, this question is directed at you because it involves legislation, and you're certainly involved in that. We're seeing in this country, again, a dialogue, a discussion going on with philosophical overtones. Libertarians in particular are taking the position recently that government has become very powerful and that most of our evils can be directed at the policies of government, and they believe that the liberties and the rights of individuals at birth are very extensive, and therefore the power of the state should be at a very minimum. And they criticize planning and zoning and land use legislation and stress very heavily the concept of the sacredness of private property. Now, this is certainly really a major issue when we get involved in the environmental questions and environmentalists asking for legislation. How would you answer the charge of libertarians that planning and zoning and land use legislation is very harmful to a free society, and also they contend rather unconstitutional?
Well, I think maybe it's important to recognize that property rights have never been an absolute. There have always been certain court decisions and certain regulations that were considered constitutional in view of the best public interest. And I think simply too long, maybe, we have concentrated on private property rights and forgotten that there are also obligations that go along with those rights. And it's time to give them some concentration, too.
Okay, thank you. Dr. Wright.
I believe this question will probably be addressed to Doug Scott. I'll have to make an assumption here that you might be familiar with this. E.F. Schumacher has recently become quite well known as an economist with his publication of his book, Small is Beautiful, and which I understand this book has been well received by the third world and underdeveloped countries and is now beginning to receive quite a bit of attention by the Western world. I'm wondering, and of course this is antithetical to the philosophy upon which most of the Western world, particularly the United States, has been operating. I'm wondering if you would care to comment on the implications and applications of this philosophy.
Well, I will do so in the most general of terms. Basically, the thesis that Professor Schumacher is advocating is one that runs counter to the prevailing, I almost want to say, religion of our society. It's so fundamental in our whole concept of how our society ought to function in the Western world, that growth, bigness, more of everything is not only good in its own right, but is the engine which drives social improvement. That is, not only is growth good because you get some particular rewards for the economy, but in fact, without growth, society itself cannot prosper and progress. And what it comes back to, it seems to me, is the confusion that our society has made between progress in a material sense and progress more broadly defined. I don't know anyone who isn't for the progress of the human spirit. I don't know anyone who isn't for the progress of the sense of man's responsibility to his fellow man and to the planet he lives on and to his own highest aspirations. That doesn't have a thing to do with material progress, more and more goodies to be piled up as an exhibition of worldly wealth. Perhaps what Professor Schumacher is calling us back to, from the perspective of an economist, he of course is a true radical, is he's calling us back to more fundamental human values, to the higher aspirations that go beyond material well-being or material superabundance that's become sort of the watchword of Western society, and to looking for our satisfaction, our sense of progress, and our sense of achievement in just a whole different realm of values, of human relationships and of cultural achievements and so forth, which is quite luckily fully consistent with a more rational energy and resources policy all around. And small is beautiful is his thesis. Growth in its own, for its own sake, or as the engine to drive social progress, is something that he denies. And I think that the enthusiasm with which this idea has been received, not only in the third world, but increasingly here at home. In the United States, the book is rapidly achieving a particular popularity. That this idea is now going to enter in to the debate that our society is going to face as we come up to grips with limits on our material abundance. For example, you referred to the speeches recently being made by Mr. Hodel of the Bonneville Power Administration. He went to some pains to, in those speeches, to attack conservation-minded people and environmentalists because we were anti-growth and because we were against this theory that growth is good and growth means social progress. And he held up to ridicule the Limits to Growth book that came out from the Club of Rome here about 3 years ago, and it caused a great deal of discussion. And I'm sure once he gets around to reading E.F. Schumacher that Mr. Hodel will be equally upset with the kind of attitudes that he espouses. What we think is that we don't want to enshrine Mr. Schumacher any more than we particularly want to enshrine Mr. Hodel as having the right philosophy. But rather, I think it's time that we get to a point of really debating some fundamental assumptions that our society has made for a couple of 100 years that may just not be accurate, and in fact may be lethal. It just, before we go any further down the path that's brought us to the kind of energy crisis and resource limitations that we face in our so-called affluent society, maybe we'd better test in a critical way the underlying assumptions about growth. And in that process of testing, Small is Beautiful, the book by Professor Schumacher, is sort of the emerging Bible.
Maybe Dorothy Riley might want to comment on that for...
No, continue that. I wanted to backtrack on something else.
Yes.
I wanted to backtrack just for a minute to answer a little bit more fully your question on private property rights, because Montana has taken action in legislation that might be of interest to Idaho. Perhaps you have something similar already. In the past legislative session, we passed a Conservation Easement Act, which sets up a system for willing landowners to sell certain interests of their land, either to a private group or to a state agency, such interests as development rights or scenic easement or waterfowl habitat or whatever is particularly important. Thus, the owner would maintain fee title, but give up other rights in order to protect that piece of land, and he would receive compensation for the sacrifices that he's made, and he also could possibly work out some system of preferential taxation for his agreement to do this. And I think this is a very important kind of a concept to bring into land use planning. As I said, I think we've fallen a little short on the obligations of land use to the future generations. I really think we owe it to them to preserve our prime agricultural land in an open condition, certain areas of key wildlife habitat and so forth. But I think we also have to realize that when landowners are making certain sacrifices that are in the public interest, then we, the public, should in some way compensate them. And I think this is a very good kind of approach to take, just one of many.
Thank you very much. Mary Lou Reed.
Well, we're this far into the program with somebody from the Sierra Club, and we haven't said a thing about wilderness. So, Doug, can I ask you what's so great about wilderness, and who needs it, and why do you spend so much time on it?
Wilderness is an interesting concept. It's not a concept that the Sierra Club invented. It's a concept that emerged out of the culture, particularly uniquely in America in the late 18th century, 19th century, first symbolized by the establishment of the Great Yellowstone National Park, 2 million acres in 1872, and in the intervening now 103 years has been carried forward with not only the elaboration of our national park system to save the most spectacular of the great natural wonders that we have in our country, but also through now a wilderness system for preserving areas which may not be particularly spectacular, but which offer, in the final analysis, samples of what the American earth was before we came along and changed it all. And the values of areas of wilderness for people are very many. I would start with the value because I must say I don't get into areas of wilderness very often, and when I used to live on the East Coast, I knew an awful lot of people who never did. That areas of wilderness, the preservation of a sample of the diversity of the American earth, is a concept which has great value to people who don't use it at all. That is, who don't strap backpacks to their back for one reason or another and hike all over it, as some people are able to do. The homeowner who lives high above New York City in a high-rise may also find great value from knowing that the wilderness is there and that there are places where the spirit of the earth and the wildlife is able to operate on, hopefully, its own terms. Now, wilderness also, quite obviously, has enormous values for people who do use it. I guess you don't have to go much farther to justify areas of wilderness than the fact that they're very popular. and they're used by a broad spectrum of our society, not just the hardy and the young, but also young families and elderly people and people from every walk of life. Often in our work for wilderness, we hear the charge made that it's the young and the physically able who are scaling the peaks of the wilderness and so forth. And I always invite anyone who makes that argument in my presence to just come with me and stand by the trailhead at the entrance to any wilderness area for a day or two, and just we'll take a look at who's going in and who's coming out and see what kind of people they are. Because on those occasions when I do walk in the wilderness areas around the Northwest, it's my observation that what I see is a cross-section of our society and not some great elite taking advantage of these areas. Now, saving of wilderness areas then is a matter of preserving a diversity of values. It's an idea. It's a cultural idea as much as it is a kind of a recreation area. And in fact, I am one who feels that the recreational values of wilderness areas are just one of the values, and that the cultural values, the educational significance, the importance of the idea to people is also extremely important. We are fortunate in this country to still have the opportunity to preserve a reasonable sample of the diversity of the wilderness that once covered all of our land without excessive costs in terms of locking up resources, the kind of thing that's sometimes charged by people who oppose wilderness. We can still, for example, preserve Idaho's great river of no return wilderness, 2.3 million acres, the largest complex of wilderness in the lower 48 states, as a really pristine example of the original Idaho, the Idaho that shaped the people who live in this state today. We can still preserve enormous areas of the most pristine wilderness in Alaska without an enormous cost in foregoing other resource values. We can preserve those areas for that kind of function. And to those who argue that wilderness is not worth it and that we have enough, I would only point to the fact that it is valued and used by a great many people. And to those who tell me that Idaho, for example, is a state that has enough wilderness and that the people of Idaho want no more, I would only remind them that the public hearings on the Idaho Primitive Area, which were held by the Forest Service a couple of years ago, leading up to the proposals that are now before the Congress, turned out people from every walk of life in the state of Idaho, not just the Sierra Club members, but a great many more, who overwhelmingly supported the preservation of the largest possible area of wilderness, the full 2.3 million acres of the river of no return wilderness. The other immediate wilderness issue in this part of the world, of course, is the saving of Hell's Canyon and the kind of wilderness that is liquid and that runs down a river channel. And the Congress is about to preserve Hell's Canyon after decades of debate. And the people of Idaho support that. They clearly support that. Their political leaders support that. And I think that demonstrates that it isn't just something the Sierra Club is out to protect for the Sierra Club or other conservation groups, but that wilderness reaches and touches something fundamental in the lives of all of us.
I have a question that's directed at either one of you that wishes to answer it. Something we haven't talked much about today, although certainly related to what we're doing, is the amount of water pollution and air pollution that we have in our society. And all the reports that I've ever read have a very high price tag on its elimination and cleaning it up. And those reports usually advocate that some might be passed on to the consumer in the form of higher prices on products, as we talked a little bit about earlier in another way. And however, they all also talk about the federal government coming in with funds with sewage systems, which they have, and other things. If we're going to really make a great headway in improving the quality of air and water, it seems that it may take more federal funds. What should we take those funds from that are being used for other things now to turn them to this pollution problem? What would you recommend that we de-emphasize while we're emphasizing this? I assume you would be advocating more federal funds.
Well, the case for cleaning up pollution to a reasonable degree is overwhelming, of course. The costs, as you say, are going to be, are and will be very great. What that demonstrates is not that we shouldn't do it, but that we're paying the price today for our heedlessness over generations in the past. And we're having to run to catch up. with the wastes and the discharges and the heedlessness of decades and at least a full century of the industrialization of this country. And yes, funds are going to have to come from the federal level, they're going to have to come from tax receipts, they're going to have to come through the pricing mechanism and all these other sources to pay the costs that are involved. When you get down to the question of what are you going to give up in terms of the federal budget in order to enhance the budget that's available for the control of pollution, I think the first answer is that you'll have to give up, you'll have to sacrifice those programs which are less related to the well-being and welfare of the people, and I mean all the people, and as against those that are more related to the welfare of all the people. And it's the standard answer for people that are asked this question, but the first place I would look would be the Defense Department. And the second place I would look would be into the heavily funded research and development efforts in sectors of our economy that maybe cannot be justified as being that directly related to the accomplishment of human values. The space budget, which of course is cut back dramatically, but perhaps we're into some luxuries that, as against the costs of cleaning up our air and our water, we just can't afford. And the first place, as I say, I would look would be the budget of the Pentagon.
I'd like to just add one thing, and this is in the energy realm, that it sometimes seems to me a little more careful organization on a national energy policy might be of help in eliminating some of the pollution in the first place. For example, Montana coal has gained overnight popularity because it's low sulfur content, and we have strict national standards on sulfur. It's turning out, however, that coal is really no bonanza at all. It's got a lot of other very serious problems, among them high ash content, high heavy metal content, and it's very low BTU. It's very low-grade coal. And so in some of these places where the coal is being burned, it takes great volumes to produce the same amount of BTUs that a much smaller quantity of higher-grade coal could produce. So it's popular because it's low in sulfur. When you look at the volumes that you have to burn, it's not low sulfur, and it has really many other things that are very disadvantageous to it. If we had a little bit more careful planning on a whole national scale as to what coal should be burned, if indeed we're going to burn it, and a little bit more organization about the transportation of that coal to assure the greatest net energy gains, it seems to me that we might be able to come out with this kind of organization in avoiding some of the pollution.
Thank you very much. We're out of time. I'm sorry that I have to interrupt. On behalf of our panel, Doug Scott and Dorothy Bradley, I want to thank you so much for being with us today. You've had a very, very busy day, and you were so kind and thoughtful after all of those activities to come by for this interview, and we appreciate it very much. And I also thank our panel, who have been both very busy today also, for taking time to work so hard this evening. Ladies and gentlemen, I hope you've enjoyed our program, and I invite you to be with us again next week at the same time on this station when we'll be interviewing another personality. And until then, good evening.
The North Idaho College Public Forum can be seen at this same time each week over this station. The preceding student production was brought to you by videotape recording.